Good afternoon. My name is Geneviève Zabriskie. I'm director of CREASE. I'm also director of the Copernicus program in Polish studies, and I have the great pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Krystyna Feravari from the Department of Anthropology. But before I do so, I just want to welcome you to the first lecture of the academic year, CREASE lecture, and just make a few short announcements. So this year we prepared the program thinking about themes that several speakers could relate to. So the talk today is part of a mini-series on material culture. What is it, the exact title? Material Culture and Social Change in Russia, Eastern Europe, and Eurasia. So Professor Feravari is giving a talk on that. We have also Rebecca Friedman, who will be speaking about material culture and domestic life in Russia. And Michael Meng, in a few weeks, will talk about Jewish ruins in Poland and Germany. Another mini-series that we have is an ongoing theme and collaboration we have with the Frankel Center of Judaic Studies on Polish-Jewish related themes. So Michael Meng will be a part of that. We have also several speakers. They're not here. Well, they're not written on that specific slide, but we have films also to be shown on that specific theme. And we have this fabulous collaboration with the Michigan Theater that's showcasing Martin Scorsese's masterpieces of Polish cinema every Monday at the Michigan Theater for most of the fall. So I really invite you to see that. These are reworked, redigitized copies of classics of Polish cinema that Scorsese basically curated and got together in a series. So I invite you to this. And today we have our own Krystyna Feravari, who's Associate Professor of Anthropology and also Associate Director of CREASE beginning this term. She received her PhD from the University of Chicago, and she's the author of this fabulous book here, Politics and Color in Concrete, Socialist Materialities and the Middle Classes, published last year, just in the spring, right? Yeah. With Indiana. 2013, so last fall. So now we get to have her speak directly. She crafted a talk for us to talk to us about the book. She works on materiality, consumer culture, aesthetics, popular culture, and socio-historical transformation, especially in socialist and post-socialist Eastern Europe. Hungary is her specialty, and she has been published in journals such as Cultural Anthropology, CSSH here, Comparative Studies in Society and History, Social Identities, Ethnos in City and Society. So please join me in welcoming her today.
Yeah, where did she go? It's do you know how to? Okay, here we go. Hang on.
So we tried this new little feature with coming attractions to give you a visual cue on what's coming. But now is the real thing. Let's turn off the lights. Yeah.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming today. I'm sorry for those of you that have read the book that this may be a rehash of stuff you already know. I have a lot of slides, and I'm going to try to get through this in the time we have. I may have to skip some things. Please let me know if I'm going too fast. I will try to not sacrifice clarity for speed.
You'll need to use the mic.
But I want to move around a little bit. Donna. Okay. I will just do what I want. Okay. So I dropped the home decor because I think I'm going to be talking a lot about architecture as well as just interiors today. Okay, three basic terminological issues that are kind of central to the talk. First is thinking about nationalism. Conventional understandings of nationalist materialities are things like flags and maps and maybe folk dances and these very obvious kind of iconic ways of understanding national symbols. There are other ways to understand nationalist materialities way beyond something like that. Everything from this new kind of thing of commodifying things about the nation, for example, brie cheese, or in Hungary, I'll show you a slide of it, but certain products of Hungarian provenance, like Helia Day face cream or Pick salami, or some of these things that are corporate entities, but are also considered very Hungarian, and people have affective sentiments towards products like this. Then there are other things like landscapes, furnishing styles. I think Sweden is probably the country that's most identified with a particular furnishing style, but it's true of regions in the country where, you know, if you think about regional nationalism like the Southwest with certain kinds of furnishings. So lots of things in the material environment that actually can affect your affective sentiments of your identity as a national subject that aren't obvious. Okay, and that's the kind of level that I'm going to be talking about materialities today. Political subjectivities, a little bit jargony, but it's basically the idea of your sense of yourself in the world vis-a-vis the political regime you live in. So vis-a-vis the state, how you understand yourself as a citizen. And along with that is this notion of consumer citizenship, which I think you can think of in two different ways. One is the ways as consumer culture has emerged in industrial societies, the ways certain blocks of people can leverage political power through the wallet, right? So in the United States, you can think of the civil rights movement and how African Americans were able to boycott businesses and leverage a kind of consumer citizenship. So in the face of absent rights, they were able to leverage their wallet. Women's groups have done this too. So that understanding of, you know, voting not with your feet, but with your wallet. But the other side of it is your sense of what you're entitled to as a citizen of a state. And this is particularly important in the socialist state. I think with one of the popularities of neoliberal reforms is that it's often a losing proposition for states to invest themselves in things that they claim as their own. In other words, then they're responsible for, like Amtrak, for example, things that public services that people then feel the private can do better, for example. So this retreat of the notion of a public good and citizens imagining themselves in some ways as consumers. This is especially true under the socialist state because in a way it brought these three things together through the way citizens' rights were explicitly tied to their rights to things, to education, to healthcare, to housing, and also to a particular standard of living that I'll be talking about more as we go along. But this sense that the socialist state was going to provide everyone with a modern standard of living that was going to produce them as citizens. Okay? So that's sort of basic architecture. All right, this is the scaffolding of my book. I'm not going to talk about lots of things in the book, and I'm sorry that I'm going to have to sacrifice a lot of detail and nuance in this very fast march through these periodizations. But what I've done is tried to think about aesthetic periods rather than political temporalities. And the next slide will show that a little bit better. So you'll see on the right a more political economic ordering of Hungarian history since World War II. On the left is the way materialities, the temporality of materialities is not the same as political economic temporalities. So what's not on here, for example, is that after the war, a lot of Hungary looked like a bourgeois post-imperial country with lots of, grand buildings, and then also a country of an impoverished working class and a very backwards peasantry, right? So that's a materiality that was left over that the socialists had to contend with one way or another, and that they actually used to think about in presenting the vision of the world that they were going to bring into being. So the sense that those materialities don't necessarily go away just because the political regime has changed. So they're still there, and the meanings can change. So for example, when socialist realist architecture came in, for many it was associated with Stalinism, but by the 70s or 80s it seemed like much classier, higher quality places to live. And in the city I worked in, which was a socialist town, brand new, so that's why I can start here, because there was nothing there except some village houses pre-1950. But by the 1970s, for example, architecture that used to be associated with Stalinism was now considered high class, nicer, more centrally located. Okay, so just to give you a sense of these shifting temporalities, some of which are all here, all coexisting in the present. My book ends sort of the early mid-2000s when organicism really is still Hungary united with Europe. What I'm trying to get to, if I have time, is thinking about this shift to the right and how the kinds of materialities that became very popular during the socialist era, this organicism, provided affordances and also constrained the possible in politics in the 1990s, and then how it's moved today. So I hope we get there, but there's a way in which religion was really absent from earlier iterations of this organicism, but it's coming back with a vengeance, and not just Christianity, but paganism. so hopefully I'll get there. Okay, just something quickly about communist. There's communist ideology, and then there's the ideology that ended up being used by communist regimes for their material environment, and that was essentially modernism, international modernism. Let's take away socialist realism from that. So the sense that three basic things in the apparatus of building a material world under socialism is centrally planned economy, then the kinds of people that were to be produced, this transformation into a socialist person, a socialist citizen, was both participating in the labor, and under the Stalinist era, a very literal version of participating in the labor of building socialism. So in the socialist city, students were shipped this muddy site from all over the country to help literally build socialism. Later, it just becomes working. So labor for the state, being a worker of any kind, being a bank teller, for example. But the second thing is the legacy of avant-garde modernism, and that is that the material world itself can shape people. So social engineering through the transformation, the radical transformation of space. And this is something that in some ways we all ascribe to somewhat. The sense that our lives will change if we move into this other space, or that certain people are produced by the spaces they live in. Of course, anthropologists have long shown that while to some degree it does, of course it affects your life, that it's never deterministic. So the kinds of social engineering that people attempt to run through with changed built environments rarely ever produce the desired changes, especially if people aren't on board with what's supposed to happen. Okay, so the town I work in, let me just a little bit, this idea of planned cities is also shared with an avant-garde modernist, obviously Corbusier, and a whole international modernist movement that wanted to combat the ills of capitalism with planning the urban environment. So modernists who had been in self-imposed exile during the interwar period from Hungary all came back, and Tibor Wiener, who was the architect of the first socialist city, thought he was going to get the dream of a modernist architect, which was the ability to plan the city in its entirety. Well, he was a little bit disappointed. So some of the first buildings he proposed were modernist. Classic modernist were devoid of ornamentation, sort of symbolizing and hopefully producing classlessness through egalitarian living arrangements, trying to get rid of the center periphery division of cities, green belts, and then buildings like this, which have no wasteful roofs, no wasteful internal spaces. Socialist realism, however, comes in with a vengeance in 1950. Those of you who know Russian history, Stalin's reintroduction of a new wave of socialist realism. And Stalin was an anti-modernist. He says that's just elite bunk. The working classes can't interpret those ugly cubes. That's not what we want state socialism to look like. We don't want to appeal to people like that. We want them to be able to read in a semiotics that is familiar to them the grandeur of the state socialist project. And that meant that the party buildings should be big and tall. They shouldn't, and Tibor Wiener had designed a little teeny party headquarters in the middle of town. But they were also mad about those socialist cubes. So they wanted this neoclassical design, apartments with parquet floors and big windows and bourgeois, basically, interiors that communicated to the working man that they're going to be living in the kind of environment that is now commensurate to their raised up rank in society. So that meant curtains and so in many ways the return of traditional divisions of labor in the family, despite the fact that women were being pushed out into the workforce. All right, so socialist realism ends really everywhere. Stalinism dies, of course, in 1953, but the Hungarian Revolution in 1956 was a signal throughout the bloc that this kind of authoritarian communism was so unpopular and also economically unsuccessful. The forced industrialization program had brought agriculture into crisis. So two messages was that the kind of that socialism itself had to change, but the other was that the Soviet Union was not going to let the East Europeans out of the bloc. So 10 days, the Hungarians were able to push the Soviets out of the country, but then the tanks come back in, and that was the end of that for the next 34 years. Okay, and in Hungary, one man, János Kardar, comes in 1956, 1957, and he stays in power for 30 years. So it's 3 decades of stability in Hungary, which was, there were lots of long-term leaders, but that level of stability was unusual. Okay, so this ushers in what an era that I call socialist modern, and it's partly connected to Khrushchev's push against also socialist realism and the introduction of thinking of technologies that might be important from the West as ideologically free or neutral. So in other words, just because a technology comes in from the West, it can be used by anybody because it's technology. So it doesn't carry with it all the bad things that other things from the West brought in. And this kind of prefabricated building form was a way of confronting the massive housing problem, doing it quickly. It also works with central planning, this idea of central planning and setting up factories, and harnessing, right, the potential of the Industrial Revolution and mass production in the service of producing lots and lots of housing. So you see how in the beginning it was presented, it also could be presented as both a form that was experimented on in the Soviet Union, but also came from Finland and other places in the West where they were also, right, in England, lots of places in the West that were also putting up this kind of housing. This is an actual picture of the way prefabricated concrete blocks were dropped into place in the building, in these buildings. This is an ad from the early 70s where they're superimposing the modernity of this kind of building with, so they before Photoshop cut out the block and reinserted the television. So the shape, the shape of the television, that sort of unadorned rectangular shape, and the shape of the the panels are kind of superimposed in this celebration of a kind of modernity. I wanted to say though that the text has nothing to do with socialism on it. It's all about for the family's pleasure, for the family's comfort, the television. So already socialist kind of advertising that's talking about, in this case, how the socialist state is providing a modern standard of living and not just ideology. Okay, the interior design was also, so furniture factories were set up to produce this mass-produced kind of furniture, and the idea was to get rid of that central table, that cluttered up space, and that the family sat around, and through the open plan, which of course was very popular in the West, and Hungarians were quite aware of that, so it was considered a modern innovation for openness, informality, right? Instead of sitting up at hard back chairs pushed against a table, you're lounging back in low sofas where the body is much more relaxed and informal. So it's already more egalitarian with the openness, flexibility, and this shift of the body into lower flexible furniture, getting rid of ornamentation, and it's couched in a very specific language about getting rid of the past. So they were trying to convince not just peasants to get rid of the furniture that they are so attached to, but also to get the children of the bourgeoisie and gentry to overcome their attachments to heirloom furniture. And the language was of like modern, bright hygiene, and how those old ornamental materialities just burdened people. They collected dust. They tied you to the obligations of the past. They imprisoned people in these dark, claustrophobic interiors, and they replaced that with light, bright, lots of talk about sunlight, about hygiene, about how these clean, sleek surfaces are easy to clean. They're mobile, so the kind of analogy with social mobility, it's mobility of the furniture, and also the sense of replacement that, you can move the furniture pieces around as the family changes, and you'll, if it breaks or you get tired of it, new stuff will come in. So a very different idea from the kinds of furniture that you tried to collect and hang on to and pass on through generations. This is about liberating people from that sense of family history and from an identification with the class politics of the past. Okay, one strange thing about this photo is that they showed a real photo of the room and how it was going to be transformed. This was a genre on television, in magazines and newspapers. I found it everywhere, but this genre of telling people how they should transform their beautiful bourgeois interiors or beautiful peasant into this kind of boxy, linear, flexible kind of, again, in this very loaded language. The way they did this room is they had to actually draw this picture, because there's no way that the furniture, the way they've arranged it, could fit in that room the way it was. So what they did is they dropped the painting, so it makes the door still is the same size, and you'll see how the door looks really oversized compared to the furnishings. So it's trick of the eye. So a lot of it was wishful thinking, in fact. And what I'll argue later is that people pretty quickly became aware that the open plan, which as it was originally developed, was supposed to be about having lots of rooms in the house that are open onto one another. And instead, what happens is you get the open plan used to subdivide spaces in one room for different atomized activities. So there's a children's corner over there for them to do their homework. There's a stereo corner over here for the husband to play, his records when he comes home at the end of the day, and then a bed. So all of these very disparate activities were supposed to take place in this one space. But still, it was for many people a very exciting and modern time, and the state really did spend a lot more money and effort producing material goods that people liked. The shift to plastics and polyesters, which of course was very big here too. And this says you can jump on plastic. It's so unbreakable. So the practicalities and the color and the miniskirt, and then this lovely lady and this is another discourse about be more demanding. So this wasn't about trying to get people to be more invidious distinction. It was about raising up the entire population to this level of modern socialist citizenry. And of course, there's competition with the West going on. And so orange, that's kind of a joke. So some residents came from this kind of background, in which case they were not necessarily happy about their new living arrangements, but others came from places. I mean, this is actually a very nice peasant house, but there's not going to be any running water in a place like this. It's outdoor. There's no plumbing. Outhouses are used. So you see that just if you look at the numbers from having an indoor toilet from 1949 to 1990 was a huge increase, and central heating, some kind of piped-in heating. So I want to emphasize that, because now I'm going to get into the more critical version of here we have the socialist ideal, modern, and also that these are both photos taken from the interiors of these panel construction apartment buildings. The bourgeois interior just got moved wholesale into the little room, and there's a painting against this wall that's actually of an old bourgeois interior with the high ceilings, because these have very low ceilings. And then a tista soba, or the clean room of the peasants, the peasant parlor, also in a housing estate apartment. Okay, so you'll see that socialist generic overlaps with socialist modern, because that your feelings about your sentiments towards a living space can coexist. You can be very happy with the home, the way you've decorated it, and your stuff, and its home, etc. And even some of the materialities you love, and then at the same time you can pick on the same building and things when they break down as indexing like a state that's not taking care of you properly. Okay. So the ahistoricism, this again is we think of these landscapes as being just there from the get-go, but historically you have to think about how these emerged slowly. And in the 60s they were all 4 or 5 story high. So you don't get these enormous gargantuan estates until the 70s. And so in the 60s they were a much more modern place to live. And there weren't that many of them. And they were more integrated into the community. In the 70s is when you get this massive shift to these. And also the sense of uniformity, when there are only a few of them, they're just one among many kinds of buildings. But in the 70s is when you get this massive uniformity. And it's not helped by the fact that newspaper articles did designs like that. So ahistorical, completely disconnected from place, from time, could be anywhere. And there's lots of literature all over the East Bloc and in the Soviet Union too about dissatisfaction with this sort of thing. The other thing is lots of other things like goods and stores weren't individuated. They again indexed this abstract state as the source. So they weren't marked. They were marked. I have a picture of clocks. These clocks were all marked with the Hungarian clock manufacturer, or some kind of Comecon, which was the Soviet economic sphere, some other kind of Comecon country. So you had these very abstracting, impersonal indexes to an abstract impersonal state for some things. The paradox is that this was happening as more socialist goods were getting branded with the names of particular localized Hungarian companies. So something like a Tisa shoe Tisa shoe got an Adidas contract, right, in the 70s. Hungarians were thrilled about that. It meant that Hungarians could produce a quality shoe that it was good enough for Adidas. And also, these Tisa shoes were on the Hungarian market, and they were much loved. Not as much as Adidas, but still much loved. But they weren't identified with this abstract impersonal state. They are identified with the local Tisa shoe factory. So as you get more goods imported from the West, ironically, as the selection of goods increases, some goods in some environments, especially these housing estates, are what get identified with the socialist state as this abstract impersonal identity that doesn't care much about its citizens. So these are just pictures of okay, so how these housing estates and goods were read was, and of course this semiotic was set up by the state itself, was shabby quality was sort of how much we're valued as consumer citizens, what the state thinks of. So the state has this rhetoric of be demanding, and at the same time, what's it giving us to be demanding? So the paradox and the irony there. Uniform goods. This happened in the West too with Fordism. There was just flux in the market. Today we have an unbelievable diversity of goods that has to do with new forms of production that emerged in the 70s. Small batch. It's largely a technological as well as political economic phenomenon. But uniformity in these housing estates was kind of, again, this way this modernist abstract bureaucratic state was treating people like numbers, not as individuals, sort of bodies that were supposed to be able to make do with what was produced. And then the question of fashionability, the Trabant, for example, I mean, one of the great things about the Trabant is it did not change design from 1960 to like the 1980s. Exact same design, exact same colors. So that created, in one hand, like a cross-generational affection for the Trabant once it was gone, but at the time it didn't do any of the work that people were coming to want from distinction. So very quickly about, oh boy, I'm taking too long. I'll just tell you about the Band-Aid. If you think about how this logic then gets projected onto the few Western goods that were imported, a Band-Aid is a great example. If you think about how the Band-Aid communicates to you that it wants to take care of you, that it wants to make it easy for you to put a bandage on, that I mean, parents now use Band-Aids to, instead of a kiss sometimes, to fix their baby's boo-boo, right? So the Band-Aid, it comes packaged, it's sterile. Instead of having to get out stuff and while you're bleeding, cut the bandages and stuff and strap it on your list. And this, so wow, what kind of economic system cares for people so much that it innovates something like a Band-Aid? All right, so lots and lots of people end up living on these spaces. So, I know, but I have to get to, this is the meat of this stuff. So what happens? You have these concrete block estates. What do people do then to humanize them? And interestingly enough, state organs get on board with this helping people in the effort to make furniture themselves. Do it yourself. Do it yourself becomes the order of the day. And what do you do it yourself with? Well, you do it with materials that are not mass-produced. They're not plastic. They're not artificial. They are wood, largely, handcrafted, textiles, rustic-looking, animal skins, like up here, and also folk. This intellectuals started this thing of going into the village and finding old, rustic folk things, but this became so popular that the state actually began mass-producing folk textiles, for example, and folk ceramics. So this, I call this organicist modern, where it brings nature into the house. These posters of natural scenes were hugely popular, but you see it's Wicker. This house doesn't have any folk items, but plants, trying to create divisions in the same room, bamboo, and the color schemes, all natural colors. And then folk crafts, painted plates, old things, like the value of old things that have patina and history. So important. And then making them by hand. This is all about making these things by hand. I won't talk about, but the fact that many people started having little weekend houses in the country was a big part of this. So earthy, organic, but modern, right? Not going back to old stuffy bourgeois stuff, not folk stuff. So you have a little folk chair, but modern little platforms where you lounge around, books. So you have the Hungarian pillows and the textiles and the colors, modern. Okay, paganism is an interesting thing that starts emerging here too, because the folk was brought in largely in a secular way. So not a lot of religious icons from villages come in. It's this other stuff. And there's a very interesting, those of you who know Hungarian popular culture, István a Király was this rock opera, like Jesus Christ Superstar, that was huge in the 80s, and it's about the first Hungarian king. But the weird thing is that he's presented as this emasculated, kind of wimpy, wishy-washy guy who's sort of dominated by his German mother, Gisela, and the real hero of the thing is Pogány, the Hungarian pagan who ends up getting quartered and his body distributed across the country at the end. So it's a very odd, and actually the two guys, they were like, I don't know, those two Broadway guys, but they had done a string of very successful hits, 1990 hits, and one goes far right and one goes far left, and they never spoke to each other again. So you see how socialism in some ways kept together two people who could come up with this rock opera. Okay. So I have to talk a little bit about the fact that there was a professional school of architecture that starts emerging. They're marginalized. They're sent off to do jobs in the countryside. The state, of course, during state socialism, withdrew all kinds of funding from. There was no development of the countryside except for electrification, important for propaganda reasons. You need to have a radio to tell you what's happening. So sent these guys off. Makowicz Imre and Cheta György were the most influential, Makowicz Imre especially. So these are like forestry shelters. This is a mortuary. This looks like the inside of a whale. So you see wood, but also what else, right? It's all shelter. It's all roof. Like if you think about the modernist squares having no roof, this is all roof. And there's not a rectilinear line to be seen. All wood, natural materials, handcrafted, very, very influential. This is like just roadside stuff now. That's all. So in the 80s too, thinking about this nature nationalist combination, the big protests were environmental, so against industrial pollution of the socialist state. The Nagymaros Dam project, which was going to flood this beautiful valley on the border of Slovakia. Socioeconomic. So the state, of course, was supposed to take care of everyone, and so to be a public activist for poverty was a criticism of the state. So to be an advocate for the poor was, in effect, to be a dissident. The Hungarian minorities, the Treaty of Trianon cut Hungary into a third of its former size, and there were about 2 million Hungarian, numbers, ethnic Hungarians in Romania on the Transylvanian side, and Slovakia especially like another million. So especially in Romania at the time, Ceausescu was hard on everyone, irrespective of ethnicity, but he, in the 80s, he initiated this policy of just removing and literally bulldozing down Hungarian villages in Transylvania and relocating people to different parts of Romania. So Hungarians were very exercised about this, and of course, in the Socialist Brotherhood of States, the socialist state could not take a public stand against this. And then, of course, anti-Soviet sentiment. Okay, now we get to this transformation I'm hurrying. Supernatural organicism. What happens in 1990? Well, the market comes flooding in. So the need for all this do-it-yourself goes away, and yet organicism becomes the order of the day, despite the fact that what happens? Like rapid unemployment, incredible insecurity, lots more consumer goods, but not a lot of money to buy it with. Rapidly developing and visible economic insecurities. All kinds of political things. Compensation policies were also a mess. And the first democratic government spent all its time doing things like getting rid of all the symbols of state socialism, like red stars and street names, which people couldn't find their way around because apparently some street name used to be a Communist Party member. They hadn't known that, but so lots of grumbling about that kind of thing too. And bringing back Stephen, who is both the founder of modern Hungary, but also the person to bring Christianity in. And he gets pride of place. And Makovec goes from being a marginalized architect to being the star representative of Hungarian architecture. And he built this pavilion, all of slate. There's not a piece in it that's standardized. Every piece is built and handcrafted on the spot. You see the wings, but in the center was this tree, which was supposed to symbolize the exact opposite of sort of a modernist tabula rasa, but that a country's history is what it draws on to move into the future. I can't help it. I love his stuff, even though I know I probably shouldn't politically. But this is this thing about materiality and sentiments, right? It's about being attracted to materialities that if you thought more carefully about granite countertops or the decor in Whole Foods, you might start thinking about how that decor is exactly legitimizing class inequality if you really bother to think about it too much. But it just indexes so many wonderful things that it's easy to overlook. Okay, so I don't need to go through this, do I, right? There's this shifting back and forth between socialists, who are really brought in the most neoliberal reforms. So the socialists become very identified with pandering to the World Bank and with EU demands, economic demands, austerity measures in the 90s, even though they campaigned on the platform of professionalism and that they were going to bring back some of the social welfare securities. So they get replaced by the first iteration, well, really the second iteration of Fidesz, which is this center-right party that is now back in power. So it's this shifting back and forth in politics between sort of center-right and neoliberal left, which doesn't make sense on the American political spectrum because you have, here we have the right is about social and moral issues, conservative, but at the same time neoliberal in terms of financial questions. So that's not the way things work out in many places in Europe. Okay, this is not that interesting. I just want you to look at some of these slides for how the public space and the landscape starts getting desocialized. These are early pictures like the bank. Just very clear markings, refurbishing of historical things, which of course was impossible in Dunajváros because they didn't have any. Bringing Hungary back into Europe through the participation in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so pulling it back into that sphere of influence from the Soviet. Organicism, again, this is a different kind, like more of a postmodern organicism in southern Hungary. And in the town where I work too, this arch that was erected by the villagers to commemorate people who had died in 1948, and then another one for World War II victims who were on the wrong side. This kind of rectilinear public space, the way they just plop down these stones and shrubbery to kind of organicize it. So these all curves, ancient symbolism, a computer store, again with this Art Deco kind of curving wood. Who ever heard of a computer store using wood? Like technology and wood here doesn't go together. And then 2 cathedrals, no churches in town. So people then start trying to recreate their organicist modern according to now commodified versions of it, upscaling. IKEA was very expensive, so my roommate had her husband build a model of IKEA furniture for in their kitchen. So bringing the wood paneling in. That's the last remnant of a folk stuff. Generally, the pillows and the painted plates went away in this period. This is a sort of high-end, very expensive version of the same rustic kind of organicist look. And here's another one. And the strange thing, too, was that despite the dissatisfactions with the regime change, the way people and articles described these transformations to their interior spaces exactly mirrored the kind of physiological experience or imagined experience of being released from communism, from the confines of communism, now being in an open country. So talk about freedom and fresh air and creativity and color and natural orders of things. So entirely the rhetoric that was used politically in terms of the kind of transformations Hungary was undergoing ideologically. So and then, there was also financing available if you didn't have it yourself, right? To transform your old socialist cramped kitchen into something nicer. Okay, I'm going to skip this. The house is of course, for class reasons, the house becomes very important to autonomy, all of the things about freedom, autonomy, and being out of the city. Also because the socialist state had claimed as its own the collective apartment building. So there was a way in which the new middle class had to symbolize itself as moving out. Here's thatched roofs, very expensive, high-tech thatched roofs, and mirrored in this house in tile. Okay, this just continues high. You can see how upscaled this is now. This is not do-it-yourself anymore. In Dunajváros, these old buildings now are all painted with EU money, partially, which nobody recognizes, and then, again, wood brought into the exterior. This is a new metro station just built, but can't just leave it the concrete. You have to have very... Okay, so just very quickly about the materialities of the new right, which I haven't processed well enough, but I'm starting to try to think about this. So I've already talked to you about economic nationalization a little bit. So the Hungarikum, these iconic Hungarian goods, movement of religion into politics, that's pretty obvious. But the other thing is the movement of politics into religion. So nationalism into the space of the church. And then this perplexing problem of pagan aesthetics. So this is this reaching back into ancient symbols. So part of the new Fidesz nationalization was of these little chains of tobacco shops, which is very unpopular because those used to be owned by lots of different families, and now it's a nationally owned chain. But look at the aesthetics. Red, white, and green, if you hadn't noticed before, is the Hungarian color. Hungarikum, where you got the cross in there. And this is a lot of this is economic. It's about heritage tourism, about trying to attract capital to the country and claiming, trademarking Hungarian goods. I won't talk about socialist retro, but that's another kind of nationalism. And then things like bus stops. So this is the old socialist bus stop. Doesn't that look to you a little bit like a church? So organicist bus stop, they're all over. And here we get to new signage. And then I'll end in just a second. But this is the old socialist sign for the village, Kulch. Then comes the EU sign, European village, with a bunch of stuff on it about how there's a police force in operation here and stuff like that. And then there's this welcome to Kulch with sort of an old historical crest. And then behind it is this new initiative which we see here too by the far-right party, Jobbik, to have all settlements now have their names translated into an ancient Hungarian script, which a lot of people says is actually, there's no historical basis for this ancient Hungarian script, and they also want it taught in schools, and they claim that it went out of, that Hungarians were literate with this script back into the 800s when they were tribes in the east before they came into this, into the Carpathian Basin, and that that it was under the oppression of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that this was eradicated from public knowledge. So there it is. There it is. And then the EU, which pays for so many of these beautification projects, gets represented as this. So it's really no surprise that they, like the socialist state before them, do not get credit for a lot of the beautification projects that are local. Instead, they're associated with this bureaucratic, like even the signage, just, I think the aesthetics of the sign tells it all, that that's all that's there, to remind people that this is actually money coming from a very impersonal bureaucracy. And so you get this aesthetic alignment with the Soviet Union, men in suits from a dominating country, and now men in suits again. They're just coming from the other side. So this shift to the left. I can't. The Catholic Church interior is very interesting. But the last thing is this poor guy that I interviewed this summer at the Lutheran Calvinist Church, who is, it's an absolutely beautiful structure, a modernist, organicist design. Look at the woodwork. The ideology of Protestantism is absolutely embedded in the space and the functionality, the fact that it's not overly ornamented. And he talked specifically about how people felt closer to God when they were around natural materials. And the movability, so the flexibility and the lack of so that the altar space is approachable but still raised up. The youth center was, so the whole thing's shaped like an egg, and the youth center is the center of the egg that needs to be fertilized by youth. He was very sad because youth aren't coming to the church, even though he set up a terrifying ropes course that I actually did, which is insane, and had set up a computer room. But he had put up in the exterior of this church one statue that imposes the tragedy of Trianon. See, there's Greater Hungary on the outside and the little small Hungary on the inside. On the Bible with biblical passages, conflating sort of homeland with truth and godliness. And then the second thing was very organicist. This is to the martyrs of 1956, the revolution of 1956. And this one, there you go. You see the ancient Hungarian writing again. So this is stuff. So he's trying to ground, and Jobbik is trying to ground Hungary in a pre-Christian bloodline. So this connection with the earth, the materiality, the closeness to the earth, and the organicism, and not an ostentatious bourgeois kind of organicism. It's something quite different happening. And last slide, he sort of reluctantly showed me that he had found this rock as he was building it, and he had taken it as a sign of what he was doing was right, that this rock was in the shape of Hungary. There's my foot, so just to, sorry, but just to see the contrast in the size. And I realized later why he was reluctant, where he was ambivalent about it, and that's not pre-Trianon Hungary, that's post-Trianon Hungary. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Conclusions. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Sorry I went on so long.